Then turn your Bibles to the book of Revelation, the 18th chapter. Revelation chapter 18, we're talking about Babylon. Again, we completed the book of Revelation, but it stands out in our minds that after 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and then 7 vials of wrath, 21 curses altogether, that suddenly God remembers Babylon, almost as if to say that He's got something special in store for her. In the 18th chapter, just very quickly, verse number 9, the kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived deliciously with her shall bewail her and lament for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning, standing afar off for the fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come. And the merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buys their merchandise any more. So Babylon possesses merchandise. What merchandise? Verse 12, gold, silver, precious stones, pearls, linen, purple, silk, scarlet, thyine wood, all manner of vessels of ivory, manner of vessels of most precious wood, brass, iron, marble, cinnamon, odors of ointments, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, beasts, sheep, horses, chariots, slaves, and the souls of men. And the fruits that thy soul lusted after are departed from thee, and all these things which were dainty and goodly are departed from thee, and thou shalt find no more at all. Find them no more at all. When the merchant saw these things, those that were made rich by her, they shall stand afar off for the fear of her torment, weeping and wailing, saying, Alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen, purple, scarlet, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls. In 1 hour, so great riches have come to nothing, and every shipmaster and all the company in ships and sailors, as many as trade by the sea, stood afar off, and they cried when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What city is like this great city? Now again, does that sound like the Catholic Church to you? When's the last time you bought cinnamon and odors from the Catholic Church? So what we're dealing with is at least the notion that Babylon is not what everybody tells us it is. Babylon is not some city in that Iran-Iraq region. And we're just going to quickly just go over a few things that we read last week. We were speaking of the birth of the Federal Reserve Bank, but just as well the birth of what is known as the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, coming about from a British genesis, that RIIA, Royal Institute of International Affairs, needing an American counterpart. They said, we don't want them to sound connected. So the Western side decided, we'll just call it Council on Foreign Relations. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about these people and how they founded themselves, and we've already seen a few things, but just real quick, I'm going to read out of Tragedy and Hope, and I'll probably get you the copies of this next week. But we were talking a little bit about these fellas last week. All right, now, we'll read about Ruskin in a little bit too, because you keep hearing reference to Ruskin's writings. Now listen, those of you that at least have a notion to write, understand that the greatest historic events occurred because somebody was willing to write down their thoughts on paper. All right? Great revolutions began because they read somebody's treatise. And the same thing is happening here. We read over and over again that people would read John Ruskin and they would actually achieve greatness in their pursuit of trying to bring his philosophy to pass in the world. So we'll read about him in a bit. Ruskin's message had a sensational impact. His inaugural lecture was copied out in longhand by one undergraduate, Cecil Rhodes, who kept them with him for 30 years. Remember Cecil Rhodes? We talked about him last week. Cecil Rhodes is the one whom the Rhodes Scholarship is named after. He kept Ruskin's treaty with him for 30 years. Rhodes, born in 1853 to 1902, feverishly exploited the diamond and gold fields of South Africa and rose to be the prime minister of the Cape Colony in 1890 to 1896. contributed money to political parties, controlled parliamentary seats in England and in South Africa, and sought to win a strip of British territory across Africa from the Cape of Good Hope to Egypt, and to join these two extremes together with a telegraph line and ultimately with Cape to Cairo Railway. Rhodes inspired devoted support for his goals from others in South Africa and in England. With financial support from Lord Rothschild and Alfred Bayet, he was able to monopolize the diamond mines of South Africa as De Beers Consolidated Mines, and to build up a great gold mining enterprise called Consolidated Goldfields. Now notice who's supporting him now. Who's his money man? Rothschilds. All right? Now this doesn't go far enough to start talking about even the apartheid that everybody came to hate. Maybe we'll talk about that another time. In the middle 1890s, Rhodes had a personal income of at least £1 million sterling a year, then about $5 million, which was spent so freely for his mysterious purposes that he was usually overdrawn on his account. Now remember we read last week that he spent all his money trying to bring about this great ideal of British rule of the world. The purpose is centered on his desire to federate the English-speaking peoples and to bring all the habitable portions of the world under their control. Now listen, this is what Cecil Rhodes believed in, to the extent that he would spend all his money and get himself overdrawn in trying to achieve his goal. What's his goal? To literally conquer all the lands and bring it under the control of England. Now does anybody see a problem with that? Huh? Has anybody got a problem with this guy's vision? Do you think people today don't have visions of taking over the world? Is that so far removed from our minds that people don't think this way? If you were to go out and tell somebody today, hey, I think there's a plot out there for somebody to take over the world, what would they think about you? They think you're crazy. But what is this man's mission? To take over the world. Now, was he playing? Was this just a whim of an imbecile? This guy was spending all his money on trying to bring this to pass. To federate the English-speaking peoples and to bring all the habitable portions of the world under his control. For this purpose, Rhodes left part of his great fortune to the Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, in order to spread the English ruling class tradition throughout the English-speaking world as Ruskin had wanted. So what the heck do they do with the Rhodes Scholarship people? Now, you think they don't perpetuate this vision? You think Cecil Rhodes just hangs money out there to put people through school at Oxford? What was the purpose and rationale? What is the stated purpose of giving somebody a Rhodes Scholarship? Huh? Just read it. He laid a great part of his fortune to found the Rhodes Scholarships at Oxford in order to spread the English ruling class tradition throughout the English-speaking world as Ruskin had wanted. Now let me ask you a question. Who was the last president in our country who was a Rhodes Scholar? Bill Clinton. Boy, that'll make every black man cry. Because he run around trying to act like he's black. And all the black clergymen embrace him. What do you think they're going to think if they find out that when you go to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, the whole idea behind that is to perpetuate the notion that you are going to spread the English ruling class throughout the English-speaking world? Huh? Do you think Bill Clinton doesn't believe this? Do you think he really wants to bite the hand of... Listen, I'm not making this stuff up. This is written in almost every book of every author who's ever studied this stuff. Do you really think that Bill Clinton became president because he was the most qualified man on the planet to become the leader of the free world? We're going to have fun with this when we get to it. It's actually called Who's Who of the Elite. This is actually from 1999. They probably have a more updated version. Members of the Bilderbergers, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission. What you'll have fun with is going through every presidential administration and finding out that everybody that went through their cabinet, almost everybody that you'll recognize as far as high-profile names, they're all members of these groups. And you'll find out that the presidents, before they were presidents, they were members of these groups. And I'm not just saying some. We're talking about all. Somewhere in some form or another, they are well connected in these groups. One of the probably most famous that wasn't initially was Ronald Reagan. But his whole cabinet, he had more CFR in his cabinet than any other president. We're going to have fun with this. People actually think that this is just some conspiracy theory, that this doesn't happen, this doesn't exist. What was the whole rationale of Cecil Rhodes dying young and saying, I want vast portions of my fortune to fund Rhodes scholarships? And they take the finest of the English-speaking people and they take them to Oxford and educate them. Do you really think you can undo a will? Huh? They want to perpetuate the spread of the English ruling class. Among Ruskin's most devoted disciples at Oxford were a group of intimate friends, including Arnold Toynbee, Alfred Milner, Arthur Glazebrook, later Sir George Parkin, Philip Littleton Gell, later Sir Henry Berkenau. These were moved by Ruskin that they devoted the rest of their lives to carrying out his ideas. A similar group of Cambridge men, including Reginald Balliol Brett, Lord Esher, Sir John B. Seeley, Albert Lord Grey, and Edmund Garrett, were also aroused by Ruskin's message and devoted their lives to the extension of the British Empire and to uplift England's urban masses as two parts of one project, which they called the extension of the English-speaking idea. They were remarkably successful in these aims because England's most sensational journalist, William T. Stead, born in 1849 to 1912, an ardent social reform and imperialist, brought them into association with Cecil Rhodes. The association was formally established on February 5, 1891, when Rhodes and Stead organized a secret society of which Rhodes had been dreaming of for 16 years. In this secret society, Rhodes was to be leader. Stead, Brett, Lord Esher, and Milner were to form an executive committee. Arthur Lord Balfour, which, by the way, is the man who later authored what is referred to as the Balfour Declaration, which we're so familiar with at the close of the Second World War. We'll read more about his relatives. So we've got Arthur Lord Balfour, Henry Johnson, Lord Rothschild, Albert Grey, and others were listed as potential members of the circle of early initiates. While there was to be an outer circle known as the Association of Helpers, later organized by Milner as the Round Table Organization, and we talked about the Round Tables last week. Brett was invited to join this organization the same day as Milner, and a couple of weeks later on his return from Egypt. Both accepted it with enthusiasm. Thus, the central part of the secret society was established in March 1891. It continued to function as a formal group. Altogether, the outer circle was apparently not organized until 1909 to 1913. This group was able to gain access to Rhodes's money after his death in 1902, and also to the funds of loyal Rhodes supporters like Alfred Bayet, Sir A. Bailey, and with his backing, they sought to extend and execute the ideals that Rhodes had obtained from Ruskin and Stead. Milner was the chief Rhodes trustee. Parkin was organizing secretary of the Rhodes Trust after 1902, while Gell and Berkenau, as well as others with similar ideas, became officials in the British South Africa Company. They were joined in their efforts by other Ruskinite friends of Stead's like Lord Grey, Lord Esher, and Flora Shaw, later Laura Lugard. In 1890, by a stratagem too elaborate to describe here, Miss Shaw became head of the colonial department of the Times. This is talking about the media, the Times, while still remaining on the payroll of Stead's Pall Mall Gazette. In this, she played a major role in the next 10 years in carrying in the execution of the imperial schemes of Cecil Rhodes, to whom Stead had introduced her in 1889. In the meantime, in 1884, acting under Ruskin's inspiration, a group which included Arnold Toynbee, Milner, Grey, Seeley, Michael Glazebrook, founded the first settlement house, an organization by which educated upper-class people could live in the slums in order to assist, instruct, and guide the poor, with particular emphasis on social welfare and adult education. The new enterprise, set up in East London with P.L. Gell as chairman, was named Toynbee Hall, after Arnold Toynbee, who died at age 31 in 1883. He was the original model for the thousands of settlement houses, such as Hull House in Chicago, now found throughout the world, and was one of the seeds from which grew the modern movement for adult education, and the university extension grew. As Governor General and High Commissioner of South Africa in the period of 1897 to 1905, Milner recruited a group of young men, chiefly from Oxford and from Toynbee Hall, to assist him in organizing his administration. Through his influence, these men were able to win influential posts in government and international finance and became the dominant influence in British imperial and foreign affairs up to 1939. Under Milner in South Africa, they were known as Milner's Kindergarten until 1910. In 1909 and 1913, they organized semi-secret groups known as the Round Table Groups in the chief British dependencies and in the United States. These still function in 8 countries. They kept in touch with each other by personal correspondence and frequent visits, and through an influential quarterly magazine called The Round Table, founded in 1910, largely supported by Sir A. Bailey's money. In 1919, they founded the Royal Institute of International Affairs in Chatham House. Now, let's stop there. This RIIA that we've already read about, who founded this? Bunch of rich guys, right? And what was their whole goal? To turn the whole world British. And then they wanted to show what kind of philanthropists they were, so they opened up houses where they can go live in the slums for a little while. Kind of like those folk that drive limousines into Skid Row, jump out with the cameras and pass out, dollar bills. Then they jump back in the limos and go. Got Milner's Kindergarten running the show here. Because the Times has been owned by the Astor family since 1922, this Rhodes Milner group was sometimes spoken as the Clevedon set, named after the Astor country house where they sometimes assemble. Numerous other papers and journals have been under their control or influence, or the influence of this group, since 1889. Now, again, this just shows how important it is for these people to control the media. They have also established and influenced numerous universities and other chairs of imperial affairs and international relations. Some of these are the Bate chairs at Oxford, the Montague Burton chair at Oxford, the Montague Burton chair at Oxford, the Rhodes chair at London, the Stevenson chair at the Chatham House, the Wilson chair at Aberystwyth, and others, as well as such important sources of influence as the Rhodes House in Oxford. From 1884 to 1915, members of this group worked valiantly to extend the British Empire and to organize it into a federal system. They were constantly helping on the lessons to be learned from the failure of the American Revolution and the success of the Canadian Federation of 1867, and hoped to federate the various parts of the empire as seemed feasible. Then confederate the whole of it with the United Kingdom into a single organization. They also hoped to bring the United States into this organization to whatever degree was possible. Steed was able to get Rhodes to accept, in principle, a solution which might have made Washington the capital of the whole organization, or allows the empire to become states with the American Union. The varied character of the British imperial possessions and the backwardness of many of the native peoples involved, the independence of many of the white colonists overseas, and the growing international tension which culminated in the First World War made it impossible to carry out the plan for imperial federation. Although 5 colonies in Australia were joined to the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901, 4 colonies in South Africa were joined to the Union of South Africa. Goes on and talks about the Sudan. Let's see. Let me go ahead and mark these pages. I'll get you these next week. Now, do you really think these guys were serious? You think these guys wanted to rule the world? Why does everybody think you're nuts if you tell them that somebody's actually trying to do this? Page 36, Shadows of Power. You have this. Now you've got Milner's Kindergarten. You've got the Toynbees. You've got Cecil Rhodes' vision. In line with what John Ruskin had written, the idea is to expand the British Empire to such an extent that the English-speaking peoples rule the world. They believed in such an ideal that Rhodes, prior to his death, allocates huge portions of finances to set up the Rhodes Scholarship so that they can pick out the best and the brightest and put them through Oxford so that they continue to perpetuate this plan. Well, I wonder what people would think if they found out how many of these Rhodes scholars really believe this stuff. You there on page 36? Well, before the Senate's vote on ramification, news of its resistance to the League of Nations reached Colonel House. Remember Colonel House? We talked about him last week. He was the shadow behind the establishment, working and operating in the administration of Wilson. Remember, Wilson's presidency was one that should have never been won. Taft had been sitting comfortably, should have been reelected, till they convinced Roosevelt to run as a third-party candidate, splitting the vote. Woodrow Wilson becoming president. His payback, or what he owed the establishment for becoming president, was the signing of the Federal Reserve laws that literally stripped our government of the power to coin and mint and distribute cash, turning it over to a trust that is completely public. Well, before the Senate's vote on ratification, news of its resistance to the League of Nations reached Colonel House. Members of the inquiry and other U.S. internationalists get gathered in Paris. It was clear that America would not join the realm of world government unless something was done to shift the climate of opinion. Under House's direction, these men, along with some members of the British delegation to the conference, held a series of meetings. On May 30th, 1919, at a dinner at a Majestic Hotel, it was resolved that an Institute of International Affairs would be formed. It would have two branches, one in the United States and one in England. What is this Institute of International Affairs? It's the RIIA, that which was founded, that which was birthed, that which was conceived by who? These bunch of rich British guys. Huh? We already read about that? In fact, we read it, and none dare call it conspiracy. Now, at the top of the chapter, it says, the Council's birthed an early links to totalitarianism. Why does it call it totalitarianism? What do the British, or what do these establishment players have in mind as they lay out the chessboard on the world? What is it that they have in mind? Total world domination. There is no doubt about what it is these men are thinking about. Underneath it, I put on there, this was born from the need to persuade the masses to voluntarily surrender this nation and the citizens' rights for the good of the world and their pocketbooks. All right? Because remember, socialism doesn't mean share the wealth. Socialism means somebody administrates the wealth. Now, who do you think is going to administrate the wealth? The guys that have it all, okay? They're not willing to share their wealth. They want you to share yours. They want to be the administrators. That's the whole idea behind socialism. You think everybody in socialism, in a socialist country, has everything evenly across the board the way everybody else does? Nobody does. Second paragraph. The American branch became incorporated in New York as the Council on Foreign Relations on July 29, 1921. This is the birth of the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, does the Council on Foreign Relations, does that have anything to do with our government? This is private money. These are private people. As a note of interest, the British branch became known as the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the RIIA. Its leadership was controlled by members of the Round Table, a semi-secret internationalist group headquartered in London. So the RIIA is behind all of this, and they found a Western branch in the U.S. They call it the Council on Foreign Relations. So who's running the show? Is it the American government? Who's running the government? Who's running the show now? Man, once the Federal Reserve Act got signed into power, our government really doesn't have any power, because the Federal Reserve, at the whim of the president, and I'm not talking about the president of the U.S., but at the whim of the Federal Reserve Board president, he can inflate money, deflate money, he can cause depression, he can cause inflation, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. As a note of interest, the British branch became known as the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Its leadership was controlled by members of the Round Table, a semi-secret internationalist group headquartered in London. The RIIA and the CFR is the CFR's counterpart. It has been dominant in British politics for over half a century. Were it the subject of this book, a great deal could be said about it. The CFR and the RIIA were originally intended to be affiliates, but became independent bodies, although they'd have always maintained close informal ties. In 1922, the Council stated its purpose as follows. Let's find out what the Council on Foreign Relations is about. Council on Foreign Relations aims to provide a continuous conference on the internationalist aspect of America's political, economic, and financial problems. Wait a minute. Why do we need an outside private group of bankers, especially from Britain, overlooking what America does internationally, economically, and politically, and financially? Why do we need a CFR? It is simply a group of men concerned in spreading a knowledge of international relations, and in particular, in developing reasoned American foreign policy. So, they're just supposed to be private citizens with no other intentions except to help the government. Make suggestions. Huh? Never mind that they're rich bankers, right? What are these guys? Hey, we're just a council. We're just a bunch of good guys. We're going to help devise policy on internationalism. We're going to help you out and suggest things concerning poverty. This self-description is quite similar to many others the Council has issued over the years, invariably conveying the idea that the CFR is merely a chatty foreign affairs club whose aims are innocuous and whose outlook is blandly impartial. If this is all the Council amounts to, it is curious that the establishment has expelled tens of millions of dollars on it. One does not have to look very hard to determine that the CFR in the 1920s was very unobjectively lobbying for American participation in the League of Nations. An article in the first issue of Foreign Affairs, which is the CFR's magazine, was entitled "The Next American Contribution to Civilization." Can we all guess what that was to be? Our government should enter heartily into the existing League of Nations, take a sympathetic share in every discussion broached in the League, and should be ready to take more than its share in all the responsibilities which unanimous action of the nations constituting the League might impose. Now, what was their goal? Initially, to bring us into a League of Nations. Why would they want us into a League of Nations? By the way, does anybody really think that this isn't going on today? Huh? Has anybody ever taken a look at the globe lately? Huh? And you look at the globe, and we didn't think much of it. Specifically with us, because the U.S. is over here, South America's over here, Canada's up there. But y'all know what NAFTA is, right? It's a free trade agreement that joins Central and portions of South America. So what we've established in essence, Canada, the Americas, Central and South America, with NAFTA, is a trade zone, right? What's happening over here in Japan, in China, Taiwan, and Korea? What's happening over there? Huh? You got another trade zone. Now you cross the Atlantic over here and you got Europe. Africa sitting over here all by its lonesome. But what's happening over here with the euro dollar? What's happening with this Eurasian land bridge that's now bridging Asia with Europe? What's happening in this area? Got another trade zone. Does anybody ever pay attention to this on the news? This is locked up. With all that GATT money and with all that international monetary money, this is locked up. With the euro, that's pretty much locked up. Those poor Africans. Huh? Now look at the globe. Who's running it? Huh? People just look and say, we want to help those poor Mexicans. Huh? You know, them folk in Central America, you know, they got to drive their trucks a long way, and it ain't right that as they cross international borders, there's such high tariffs. What were they really breaking down? They are breaking down what we refer to as international sovereignty. They don't want a nation. They don't want the U.S. They don't like the U.S. In fact, they hate the notion of the U.S. The thing they hate the most about, do you know what the world hates the most about the U.S.? Is that we claim to have rights, we claim to be free, and we have the nerve to give other people the finger and tell them, we'll help you if we want to, but if we don't, we won't. That's what's wrong with the U.S. We're isolationists, and we know that we're pretty secure in what we have. We don't need anybody. Now really think about it. Everybody cries about oil imports. You think if the U.S. cut off all oil, we wouldn't have cars? Huh? Man, as creative as Americans have become in this last century, man, we can do anything we want. We don't need anybody. But that's not what they tell us. That's not what they're teaching our kids. They're making our kids think that we need Eskimos. Look, let's be honest. If the Eskimos all fell off the planet, are we going to stop operating and functioning as a nation? Huh? If the earth split and swallowed up Japan. Now, as sad as that would be, is America going to go down the toilet because we don't get Sony anymore? Huh? We ain't got Nintendo. It'll just cost more because Americans charge more for stuff like that. Huh? We'll have to take it to Korea. But why are they splitting the world up into trade zones? I told you, don't just listen to this propaganda about the war on terrorism. There's the biggest problem right now. The only people who won't get in bed with these bankers are Muslims, because they think that banking system is the great white Satan. They don't want to be under the bondage of these financial institutions that run your foreign policy, that run your country once they get a hold. I see that a couple people got in trouble because some people got real mad at the terrorists and said they're a bunch of cowards killing women and children. And somebody said, well, you know, you can't be all that much of a coward to stand in a cockpit and fly a plane right into a building. You might be an idiot, but a coward, no, right? I mean, if you could stand wearing TNT wrapped around your belly and be willing to pull the pin, is that a coward? That's a martyr. That's a foolish man. But is he a coward? See, people get mad because somebody says, wow, that's more bravery than cowardice. And that's a lot of religious zeal that's misguided. Now, I don't want anybody to misinterpret me, but I'm going to tell you this. I think some of those countries got a lot more going for them by not bowing their knee to the mammon of this world. They at least can see through the junk. And they refuse to bow and place themselves under this subjection. So when we talk about the war on terrorism, now, God bless these guys out there beating the daylights out of terrorists, because I hate them. But you think that's all they're after? Huh? You know, you blow that country to smithereens, what's the first thing the bank does? Let us help you rebuild. Let us lend you some money. You're going to need protection. You know, those Indians, they got nukes. We're going to have to hook you up. How many troops you want? You want an air base? They ain't going to mess with you if there's American air base on there. And you can rent it to us. And then you got to pay us to be there. I know you ain't got the money, but you can borrow it. Isn't that the way it works? Huh? A lot of people get confused. It's always bothered me historically. Why the Allies come storming across the Normandy beaches, start whooping the Germans. And as the flow of the Allies starts moving into Berlin, all of a sudden everybody says, stop! We got to let the Russians go first. Why do we let the Russians into Berlin? Huh? And the Russians go in there and steal the jet technology, rocket technology. Here you got a country that couldn't even build a tank, at least not make it right. Suddenly they launch Sputnik and scare the daylights out of the free world. How's that happen? Who decided that Russia needed to become an evil empire? Huh? Why'd that happen? Because suddenly when Europe is split from Asia, all these poor Europeans that were afraid of Hitler and the Italians, all of a sudden when there's no enemy to fight anymore, they don't need no money. You don't need defense. You don't need no Americans on their board. You don't need anything. But as the evil Russian Empire came up into power, what happened? Now you have another antagonist on the scene. Somebody you need protection from. Somebody you got to build up the war machine just in case they come storming the borders. So what happens to Europe? High debt. You don't think Americans were on the German border for free, do you? Anybody think that? All those German military, you think they're out there just because America wanted them there? Let's go on and read. People don't believe these guys are still around. They're still around. I'll have to warn you, if there's anything bad in the margins, it was there when I got it. All right. Of course, not every article in Foreign Affairs openly boasted world government, which would have overstated the case, but typically the journal printed one or two that did, mixed with dry dissertations on a variety of international topics. No conspiracy lurked behind such titles as Singapore's mineral resources, the soybean and international trade. However, many of the particularized articles did present solutions pointing toward globalism. Colonel House, of course, was one of the CFR's founding members. As to the others, Robert Schultzinger, the wise men of foreign affairs, the history of the Council of Foreign Relations, noted that nearly all of them were bankers and lawyers. Well, that's a good combination, huh? The stereotype was unchanged 50 years later. John Franklin Campbell wrote in New York Magazine 1971 that the membership of the CFR usually means that you're a partner in an investment bank or a law firm, with occasional troubleshooting assignments in government. This raises the question, why should foreign affairs lie almost exclusively in the province of these two professions? Which is a good point. You know, almost every agenda of foreign affairs that is written or introduced by the CFR finds its way into policy. That's pretty good considering it's just a group of good old boys sitting down to hash out international problems, isn't it? The CFR's founders were specialized in yet another way. Association with J.P. Morgan and Company, Dr. Carroll Quigley referred to earlier, had a unique insight into the Council's founding. He was very close to the members of the Round Table, which was the core of the CFR's counterpart group in Britain. In early 1960s, he was allowed to inspect its secret records. Quigley termed the CFR's front group for J.P. Morgan and Company in association with a very small American Round Table group. The founding president of the CFR was John W. Davis, who was J.P. Morgan's personal attorney and millionaire in his own right. Founding vice president was Paul Cravath, whose law firm also represented the Morgan interests. Morgan's partner, Russell Leffingwell, would later become the council's first chairman. A variety of other Morgan partners, attorneys, and agents crowded the CFR's early membership rolls. So the early CFR in this country, who was it? It's all Rockefeller. Or I'm sorry, it's all J.P. Morgan. Conscious of such uniformity, the council steering committee moved to distinguish the roster by adding college professors. However, most of these had been members of Colonel House's inquiry. Furthermore, they hailed from campuses beholden to J.P. Morgan, as Dr. Quigley observed. The Wall Street contacts with these professors were created originally for Morgan's influence in handling large academic endowments. You go buy the university, give them money. You'll have fun. When we get into that who's who of the elite, you're going to have fun. Because you're going to find out that, you got a ton of professors, CFR, deans, presidents of universities, CFR. Then you won't be surprised why they push the agendas they do. The Bolshevik connections. Another denominator common to many of the early CFR members was support, material and moral, for the Bolsheviks in Russia. Now, when did they ever tell you in school that the rich men that were steering the policy and government of our country, when did they ever tell you that they supported the Russians? Huh? Doesn't it bother you that they lie to your kids? Doesn't it bother you, first of all, that they lied to you? The 1917 Russian Revolution was no exception. It is now well known that the Germans helped Lenin, who had been exiled by the Tsar into Russia in a sealed train carrying 5 million in gold. The Germans, of course, had an ulterior motive. The Tsarist Russia was fighting them on one side of the Allies, and a successful revolution would mean one less adversary for Germany to contend with. Less widely known is the U.S. contribution. Now, underline that statement in the last portion of page 38, where it says that the Germans helped Lenin. It's cut off on your page 38. All right, it's cut off. The Germans helped Lenin, who had been exiled by the Tsar. We're going to read more about that. But when it says the Germans, it's not the German people. It was Max Warburg. Paul Warburg's brother. Paul Warburg was the first Federal Reserve chairman in our country. All right? So this was private money. Less widely known is the U.S. contribution. Probably the best reference on this is Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution by Anthony Sutton, former fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institute. I'm going to tell you what, if you write stuff like this, you're going to be a former fellow at any think tank. It is based on assiduous research, including a deep probe into the State Department files. While Sutton's focus is not on the CFR, comparing his findings with the Council's early rosters proves revealing indeed. His book was actually part of a trilogy, the other two volumes examining Wall Street's link to Franklin D. Roosevelt and Nazi Germany. Just when the American patronage of the Bolsheviks began is probably unknown, but an excerpt from Colonel House's prophetic Philip Drew is not a bad place to start. Sometimes in his daydreams, Drew thought of the Russia in its vastness, of the ignorance and hopeless outlook of the people, and wondered when her deliverance would come. There was, he knew, great work for someone to do in that despotic land. Leon Trotsky, and again, Trotsky and Lenin actually founded or helped cause this revolution. Leon Trotsky was living in New York at the time Tsar Nicholas abdicated and was able to return to Russia only because Woodrow Wilson intervened to secure him an American passport. Now, we'll talk more about this, but Lenin and Trotsky were the spearhead men involved in the revolution that turned Russia communist or socialist. All right? And Woodrow Wilson gave an American passport to get him out of New York through Canada to send him back to Russia. Now, whoever tells you that in school? Doesn't that piss you off? Leon Trotsky was living in New York City at the time Tsar Nicholas abdicated. He was able to return to Russia only because Woodrow Wilson intervened to secure him an American passport. On November 28, 1917, with the Bolsheviks newly in power, House cabled Wilson that any newspaper accounts describing Russia as a new enemy should be suppressed. Isn't that violating freedom of the press? On that same day, Wilson declared that there should be no interference with the revolution. Although the Bolshevik atrocities prevented the U.S. from officially recognizing their new government, Wilson continued to express his support for them to the shock of many people. Jacob Schiff, the head of Kuhn, Lieb and Company, heavily bankrolled the revolution. Now remember Jacob Schiff? He's the guy who was together with the Harrimans and together with J.P. Morgan. This was one of the big bankers. Why in the world would they bankroll the Russian Revolution and turn them communists? This was reported by White Russian General Arsene Degulevich in his book Tsarism and the Revolution. The New York Journal American stated on February 3, 1949, today it is estimated, even by Jacob's grandson John Schiff, a prominent member of New York society, that the old man sank about $20 million for the final triumph of the Bolshevism in Russia. Other New York banking firms also contributed. Schiff died before the CFR's incorporation, but his son Mortimer and his partner, Federal Reserve architect Paul Warburg, both became founding council members. By founding member, we refer to anybody who appeared on the council's original 210-man membership roll in 1922. Examination of that list unveils rogues of gallery of Bolshevik supporters. Now, could you imagine the Council on Foreign Relations? They're all Bolshevik supporters. Now, doesn't that drive you crazy that we went through something called a Cold War? Where as a kid, I kid you not, every last Friday of the month, the air raid sirens would go on, and I would have to duck and cover under my desk, fearing that the Russians were sending nukes. They wanted us to know what to do when the nukes came. What they should have taught us is how to bend down and kiss our butts goodbye, because there ain't nothing you can hide from when they nuke you. Huh? I guess they just want to know you're dead when there's a wet spot under your chair. Now, why in the world would these same people that are telling us how evil this empire is, that established and launched this Cold War, these same people financed them? Summer of 1917 in the city of Petrograd, nerve center of the Russian Revolution. Now let me ask you this. If somebody took over Washington, D.C. today and said, all right, we're taking over the country, we're communists. Is the whole country going to turn communist? You're out of your mind. I guess if Washington, D.C. fell and became socialist, nobody would follow. There's a question you've got to ask yourself. How does Petrograd fall? And Petrograd ain't even the major city. How does Petrograd fall and then all of Russia become socialist? There's a question you got to ask. It was the nerve center of the Russian Revolution. Came one of the strangest Red Cross missions in history. It consisted of 15 Wall Street financiers and attorneys led by Federal Reserve Director William Boyce Thompson, plus a small contingent of doctors and nurses. The medical team, discovering they were a front for political activities, returned home in protest after a month. The businessmen remained in Petrograd. The mission supplied financing, first for the socialist regime of Alexander Kerensky, and then for the Bolsheviks who supplanted him. In his biography of William Boyce Thompson, Herman Hagedorn produced photographic evidence that J.P. Morgan cabled Thompson $1 million through the National City Bank branch in Petrograd, the only bank in Russia the Bolsheviks did not nationalize. What became of that $1 million? The Washington Post of February 2nd, 1918 supplies the answer. Under the headlines, gives Bolsheviki $1 million, it noted. William B. Thompson, who was in Petrograd from July until November last, had made a personal contribution of $1 million to the Bolsheviki for the purpose of spreading their doctrine in Germany and Austria. Mr. Thompson had opportunity to study the Russian conditions as the head of the American Red Cross mission, expenses of which were also largely defrayed by his personal contribution. Mr. Thompson depreciates the American criticism of the Bolsheviki. He believes that they have been misrepresented. Thompson also authorized a pamphlet praising the Soviets that was published in the United States. 3 of Wall Streeters in the Petrograd Red Cross mission, Thompson, Allen Wardell, Robert Barr, went on to become founding members of the CFR. 3 others, Henry Davison, Thomas Thatcher, Harold Swift, joined the council subsequent years. You can read all this stuff. We're going to read all this stuff later. Let me just jump into something else. Doesn't that get you mad already? Doesn't this stuff sound crazy? People wouldn't believe you, would they? People think you're crazy if you bring this stuff up. In fact, most people wouldn't even know what to tell you. Most people don't know this stuff. In fact, most people don't want to know this stuff. I'm looking for John Ruskin. And find out what John Ruskin's about. I'm going to read Rule by Secrecy for a little bit. What other page? You have... Here we go. Cecil Rhodes, the progenitor of the modern secret societies, and his academic mentor, John Ruskin, carried out a philosophical tradition which can be traced back to ancient Greece and beyond. Now, why does it say beyond? Because it goes all the way back to Babylon. All right? Cecil Rhodes didn't make this stuff up. Ruskin didn't come up with this stuff on his own. This stuff came from beforehand. Cecil Rhodes, the progenitor of the modern secret societies, academic mentor John Ruskin, carried on a philosophical tradition which can be traced back to ancient Greece and beyond. Others who followed this tradition included socialist pioneers Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And Karl Marx, son of a rabbi, Engels, an Englishman. You know what these guys did? They wrote the Communist Manifesto. Now, how many of you ever heard of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels? How many thought they were Russians? Huh? How many of you know that these guys wrote the Communist Manifesto while they were in Europe? Huh? So that form of socialism and communism, ultimately communism, wasn't it born in the West? Do you know these guys didn't just sit down and write it for free? They were commissioned by a group to do this. Born in 1853, Rhodes, the son of a vicar of Bishop Stardiford, was steeped in religious concepts from an early age. In 1879, he joined a brother who was operating a South African cotton farm. Both brothers soon succumbed to the lure of diamond prospecting. After some initial success finding diamonds, Rhodes formed De Beers Consolidated Mines Limited, named after Nicholas De Beers' family, of the mining claims he acquired. For 8 years, Rhodes divided his time between mining in Kimberley, South Africa, and studies at Oxford, where he fell under the spell of fine arts professor John Ruskin. The son of a prosperous wine merchant, Ruskin had departed from mainstream thinking to the extent that one biography described him as an inwardly difficult, lonely life, often pursued and struck by madness. That's the kind of guy you want to follow, huh? Given to frequent masturbation and nympholepsy, a frantic fondness for underage girls. Look, I'm just reading what this says. Hey, but listen, I'm going to tell you something. John Ruskin sat down and wrote and changed the world. How many times do I have to say this? If you can command the language you can command the masses. I'll just leave that one go. But for the lack of better terms, here you got a pervert jack-off. Listen, who suddenly, Cecil Rhodes, Arnold Toynbee, all of these fellas decide we're going to start a round table and we're going to rule the world, and look to what heights or to what extent they've accomplished what they've set out to do, to the point that they set up the RIA, they set up the Council on Foreign Relations, that they literally are the government behind our government. And look who inspired them. Huh? Is that a surprise? How many learned this in school? Everybody talks about John Ruskin's right, and they make him out to be some genius. No wonder he was mad. Huh? I heard stuff like that will drive you crazy. Nympholepsy, that's a new word. Frantic fondness for underage girls. Ruskin nevertheless failed to consummate his marriage. I don't believe it. Nevertheless failed to consummate his marriage to 19-year-old Effie Gray in 1848. I guess he made other parts of his body jealous. I couldn't. I'm exercising tremendous restraint right now. 6 years later, still a virgin. 6 years later, still a virgin. I guess that nympholepsy and his frequent other habits must be overtaking him. 6 years later, still a virgin, she had the marriage annulled. I guess so. A shocking development in those times. Ruskin was an ardent student of the King James Version of the Bible. That'll drive you to that. Hey, you notice Cecil Rhodes, the progenitor of modern secret society's academic mentor John Ruskin, carried on philosophical tradition. It goes on, born in 1853, Rhodes, the son of the Vicar of Bishops, Stortford. You notice these guys are all religious men? Here's what religion does to people. The son of the Vicar of Bishop Stortford. He was steeped in religious concepts. That's Cecil Rhodes. And then his mentor, John Ruskin, was an ardent student of the King James Version of the Bible, but eventually gave up his belief in God. John Ruskin, the man who inspired Cecil Rhodes, Alfred Milner, and those who formed the Round Table Secret Society, was himself influenced by the esoteric writings of the Greek philosopher Plato and by Madame Blavatsky. Those of you that have read the books and the accounts on Hitler and the occult, Madame Blavatsky was instrumental in Hitler's life. She was the founder of the Occult Theosophy Society, the books of Lord Edward Bulwer-Lytton, and secret societies in the mold of the Order of the Golden Dawn, wrote author Ick. Ruskin, who reportedly read Plato's Republic every day, embraced Plato's concept of the perfect society being one that had structure imposed from centralized leadership, a ruling class downward. Marx and Engels, the founders of modern communism, were also students of Plato and echoed Ruskin's view. Advocating tight central control over the state, either by dictator or by special ruling class, Ruskin proclaimed, "My continual aim has been to show the eternal superiority of some men to others, sometimes even one man over others." So this whole philosophy is based on what people hate to recognize, but either racial or bloodline superiority or the anointed few, the enlightened few. Those who are just smarter, those who are just gifted, those who feel themselves the superior with the ability to administer, just like our friend here, Philip Drew. These people believe that. These people ain't joking. What in the world make them think that they can rule the world and that everybody's just going to roll over for them? All right? On page 36 of your Shadows of Power. That's why I wrote my commentary right underneath the opening chapter. There was a need to come to the U.S. and establish an organization that would cause the people to roll over and yield the power to these organizations. Now, even to this day, especially after September 11th, it's going to be a little harder. And I'm telling you, God has got his hand on us despite how much we fail. But God is not going to allow this country to fall into this one world union until after the church is gone. This is why one of the main goals of these societies is to get rid of the church. All right? Because as long as there's a church, we will resist one world government. His continual aim is to show the eternal superiority of some men to others, sometimes even of one man over others. According to Quigley, Rhodes was also stirred by Ruskin's philosophies that he copied one of his Oxford lectures in longhand and kept them with him for over 30 years. Michael Bygent and Richard Lay, authors of The Temple and the Lodge, showed that Rhodes was active in British Freemasonry, which involved him with other prominent 19th century persons such as George IV, William IV, and Lord Randolph Churchill, Winston's father, Marquis of Salisbury, Arthur Conan Doyle, Rudyard Kipling, Oscar Wilde. This group's preoccupation with philosophies of Plato, Ruskin, and the Theosophist, Madame Blavatsky, coincided with the ideas of Freemasonry. With the aid of a close friend, German diamond merchant Alfred Bayet, Rhodes expanded his diamond company till 1891. De Beers owned 90% of the world's diamond production. How many of you knew De Beers owned so much as far as diamonds went? In 1890, Rhodes founded the Diamond Syndicate, forerunner of today's Central Selling Organization, that controls almost 80% of all worldwide diamond trading. He also gained large control over rapidly developing Transvaal gold mines. With ever-expanding wealth, Rhodes's dreams also grew to plans for a railroad from South Africa to Cairo, extending the British Empire to include that long-century dream of reclaiming the American colonies. Can you imagine? His dream was to reclaim the American colony. Now, how many know that, to a certain extent, they've already got them? They were financiers to Cecil Rhodes, making it possible for him to establish a monopoly over the diamond fields of South Africa, wrote Arthur Griffin. They're still connected with De Beers. In November 1997, when Baron Edmund Adolphe Maurice Jules Jacques de Rothschild died at age 71 from emphysema in Geneva, it was reported that he left substantial holdings in De Beers Consolidated Mines in South Africa. Lending support for a relationship between Rhodes and the Rothschilds was author and former British intelligence officer John Coleman, who wrote, Rhodes was the principal agent for the Rothschilds, who dispossessed the South African Beers of their birthright, the gold and diamonds that lay beneath their soil. According to Coleman, Rhodes's first roundtable group was established in South Africa with funding from the British Rothschild family to train business leaders loyal to Britain in ways to maintain control over that country's wealth. The idea of Rothschild funding behind Rhodes was also supported by Frank Adelet, who wrote in American Rhodes Scholarships. In 1888, Rhodes still made a third of his will, leaving everything to Lord Rothschild. The Round Table started as a collection of semi-secret groups formed along the lines of the Illuminati, the Freemasons, with an inner circle and outer circle, and a pyramid hierarchy. The inner circle was called the Circle of Initiates, or the Elect, while the outer circle was called the Association of Helpers. Two members of Rhodes's inner circle of initiates were British financiers Lord Victor Rothschild and Lord Milner. Rhodes called his secret society the Round Table after the legendary meeting place of King Arthur. It should be noted the Arthurian legend concerning the Holy Grail is closely connected to the controversial notion of the continuing bloodline from Jesus, the Sangreal, or the royal blood, which shall be discussed later. Now, we've talked a little bit about this before. Coleman wrote, armed with immense wealth gained from the control of diamonds and gold and drugs, round tables fanned out throughout the world to take control of fiscal and monetary policies and political leadership in all countries where they operated, setting an example for today's interlocking corporate dictatorships and tax-exempt foundations. The Round Table itself consists of a maze of companies, institutions, banks, educational establishments, which in itself would take qualified insurance actuaries a year to sort out. While some might dismiss Coleman as a conspiracy theorist, they could not say the same of Dr. Quigley. There does exist, and has existed for a generation, an international Anglophile network. We'll make you copies of this so you can understand what an Anglophile is, but somebody wants to promote the Anglos. Actually, the English Anglos. Network which operates to some extent in the way of the radical right believes the Communist Act, confirmed Quigley. I know the operation of this network because I've studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the 1960s to examine his papers. Quigley saw the goal of these groups, of which the chief aim was apparently to form the world's nations into one English-speaking entity so as to maintain peace and to bring both stability and prosperity to the underdeveloped areas, as largely commendable. So what's their goal? They want to rule the world. These people are crazy, aren't they? Now grab your other papers near the end. We'll close this out. Page 91. Now, we'd already read up to page 90, but the page 90 is your picture of the CFR. See that little chart there? Gary Allen, boy, he sure blew the lid off of this, but you see how it says CFR in the middle? And then it says Managed News Curtain. That means that the news don't let you see beyond it. But you see from out of the CFR, it's got two legs. One says Democrat and the other one says Republican. And then on the left side it says, it lists all the Democrats, and on the right side it lists all the Republicans. But what is their goal? Didn't I tell you all you do when you vote is vote for who gets to screw you? These people have the exact same agenda. They just got another way of getting there. Doesn't that drive you? How many people learn this? When they tell you this in school? Huh? So me and my wife, we get into some discussions because I sit down with my girls and I just start telling them stuff. My wife says, "Oh, why you got to tell them that?" So why they got to be lied to? My kids come home telling me about, "Oh, Dad, they're killing dolphins." So what? Now, I'm not for extinction of animals. I don't think they should be extinct. I think people should be more careful. But, man, we ain't going to stop living because dolphins quit. You know how many animals are already extinct? Life goes on. Somebody says, well, if the trees get chopped down, we won't have no air. Huh? They stopped building that 55 freeway for a while because they saw a fox in a culvert. Somebody should have got a BB gun out. Huh? Move. All right. Page 91. The following are so-called Democrats who have been now or are now CFR agents. And this is as of 1975 when this book was written. People didn't want to hear this. Dean Nickerson, Alger Hiss, Adlai Stevenson, John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Edward Kennedy, Averell Harriman, George Ball, Henry Fowler, Dean Rusk, Adam Yarmolinsky, Hubert Humphrey, John Lindsay. It is interesting to note that the rewards of cushy jobs were given by the international bankers to many men in the high LBJ administration for their services. Undersecretary of State George Ball went to Lehman Brothers. Secretary of the Treasury Fowler was taken in by Goldman Sachs and Company. Budget Director Peter Lewis, Undersecretary of the Treasury Frederick Deming, and former Secretary of Commerce C.R. Smith all avoided the bread lines by being picked up by Lazard Ferris, which is the Rothschild Corporation here. Fowler and Deming were largely responsible for policies which led to European nations claiming half of our gold and having potential claims on the rest. Now, what he's simply saying is what we've been saying all along. These men move in and out of private sector business to politics, back and forth. These guys never suffer. In fact, have you noticed that every time a president goes out of power, that guy will do a speaking circuit, make more money in one speech than he made the whole year as president? Now, let me ask you a question. What agenda is he pushing as a non-president? Huh? Have you been hearing Bill Clinton lately? Have you been listening to him talk? He's saying things like, well, the reason the Arabs are mad at us is because we need to give them more money. We need to help them more, almost as if we deserve this. We got to go give the poor people more money. That's what he's saying. You know, everybody thinks he moved to Harlem so he can be amongst the poor. He moved to get the hell away from that woman of his. Controlling the Republican Party for the CFR have been Dwight Eisenhower, John Foster Dulles, Thomas Dewey, Jacob Javits, Robert McNamara, Henry Cabot Lodge, Paul Hoffman, John Gardner, Rockefeller clan, Elliot Richardson, Arthur Barnes, Henry Kissinger, and Richard Nixon. While it's true that every administration since FDR have been dominated by the CFR, The Nixon administration set an all-time record by appointing over 110 CFR members to key positions. Henry Kissinger, the Colonel House of the Nixon administration, came to his job directly from employment on the CFR staff. Kissinger represents the very opposite of everything Nixon said he stood for in his campaign. Both liberals and conservatives admit Kissinger is by far the most important man in the Nixon administration. Administrations, both Democratic and Republican, come and go, but the CFR lingers on. This is why more things seem to change, the more they remain the same. The fix is in at the top, where the same coterie of insiders bent on control of the world runs the show. As Professor Quigley admits, there does exist and has existed for a generation an international network which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the Communists act, and that's just what we read in Shadows of Power. That acts just like the Communists act. In fact, this network, which we may identify as round table groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the Communists or any other groups, but it frequently does so. Yes, the insiders have no aversion to working with the Communists, whose ostensible goal is to destroy them. While the insiders are serving champagne and caviar to their guests in their summer mansion at Newport or entertaining other members of the social elite aboard their yachts, their agents are out enslaving and murdering people. And you are next on their list. Clearly, Chicago Tribune's editorial, December 9th, 1950, the CFR still applies. The members of the Council on Foreign Relations are persons of much more than average influence in their community. They have used their prestige, their wealth, their social position, and their education, and have given them lead to their country toward bankruptcy and military debacle. They should look at their hands. There's blood on them, the dried blood of the last war and the fresh blood of the present one, which was the Korean War. Y'all got page 93? It goes without saying that the CFR's hands are bloodier now with the gore of 50,000 Americans in Vietnam. Shamefully, the Council has succeeded in promoting as American policy the shipment of American aid and trade to the East European arsenal of the Viet Cong for the killing of our sons in the field. And you would be really upset when you find out how the American companies and how the American politicians literally supplied arms to the Viet Cong by way of the Russians. It was illegal for them to sell guns to the Russians, so they sold them all the gun parts so they can build them and send them to the Viet Cong to use against our soldiers. People would be really upset if they knew this. It should not be surprising to learn that there is, on the international level, an organization equivalent to the CFR. This group calls itself the Bilderbergers. It is scarcely one American in 1,000 has any familiarity with the CFR. It is doubtful that 1 in 5,000 has any knowledge of the Bilderbergers. Again, this is not accidental. By the way, Bill Clinton was a Bilderberger. The strange names of this group is taken from the site of the first meeting, May 1954, in the Hotel de Bilderberger in Oosterbeek, Holland. The man who created the Bilderbergers is His Royal Highness Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. The prince is an important figure in the Royal Dutch Petroleum, which is Shell Oil. By the way, who owns Shell Oil? Rockefeller. And the Société Générale de Belgique, a huge conglomerate cartel with the worldwide holdings. The Bilderbergers meet once or sometimes twice a year. Those in attendance include some political, some financial figures from the United States and Western Europe. Prince Bernhard makes no effort to hide the fact that the ultimate goal of the Bilderbergers is a world government. In the meantime, while the New World Order is being built, the Bilderbergers coordinate the efforts of the European and American power elites. And that's the last you have, so we'll stop there.